The wind bit through Detroit. Thomas Wade rubbed his hands together, trying to chase away the cold as he waited at a lonely bus stop. Suddenly, he saw a woman shivering in a thin suit. Without a word, Thomas took off his only coat and placed it around her shoulders, just hoping she'd stay warm. What he didn't know was that this one small act of kindness would change his life forever. Before we go back, tell me where you're watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story will move you in ways you don't expect. The wind tore through Detroit like a hungry beast, snow falling thick and fast from a slate-gray sky, covering the sidewalks and muffling the city's usual hum. At a nearly abandoned bus stop beneath a flickering street lamp, Thomas Wade stood hunched in a threadbare olive jacket, gripping a worn manila folder against his chest. Inside were 7 resumes, 7 silent rejections collected over the past 2 weeks. He let out a slow breath, watching it fog in the frozen night air. 46 years old, former structural engineer, widower, father, and now homeless. The red glow of a nearby pharmacy sign blinked 8:43 in the evening. The number 17 bus was running late, as it often did on snowy nights. The cold had long since soaked through his worn boots, numbing his toes until he could barely feel them anymore. Then, through the curtain of falling snow, a figure appeared. She was a woman who looked to be in her mid-30s, dressed in a charcoal business suit with a silk blouse underneath, but no coat. Her heels clicked sharply on the icy pavement as she hurried toward the shelter of the bus stop awning. Her hair, styled in elegant braids pulled back from her face, was quickly becoming dusted with snowflakes. She stopped beneath the same flickering light, breath coming in short, visible gasps, hands trembling as she wrapped her arms tightly around herself. Thomas tried not to stare, but her presence was striking. She carried herself with dignity, polished and professional, yet clearly suffering in the brutal cold. She rubbed her bare hands together vigorously, trying desperately to generate some warmth. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge. He looked away. Just another night, just another bus to nowhere. But then the wind howled, fierce and unrelenting, cutting through the thin awning like it wasn't even there. She flinched, curling inward on herself, and Thomas glanced at her again. His jacket was old, frayed at the edges and missing 2 buttons, barely adequate even for him. But it was something. He could keep it, stay silent, mind his own business like everyone else in this city did. But he didn't. The memory of his wife flashed through his mind. Catherine had always said you could measure a man not by what he kept, but by what he gave away when he had nothing left to give. Without a word, he shrugged off the coat. The cold immediately bit into his thin flannel shirt, sharp as knives. He stepped toward her and held it out with hands that shook slightly. Startled, she looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise and wariness. "You don't have to do that," she said quickly, though her voice wavered. Thomas gave her a tired smile, lines deepening around his eyes. "It's a cold night. You need this more than I do right now." She hesitated, her eyes taking in his worn clothing, the folder with its telltale professional weight, the careful way he held himself despite obvious hardship. "But you need it more than I do." Still, he gently draped it over her shoulders, his movements careful and respectful. "Not tonight," he said simply. "You look like you've got somewhere important to be." The warmth startled her. It smelled faintly of soap and laundry detergent, clean despite everything. She pulled it tighter around herself, feeling tears prick the corners of her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, folding his arms tightly across his chest to ward off the cold. They stood together in silence as the snow continued to fall around them. After a long moment, she turned to him, really looking at him now. "What's your name?" "Thomas." "Thomas Wade. I'm Valencia," she said. "Valencia Brooks. Nice to meet you, Valencia." The low rumble of an approaching bus broke through the silence. Headlights pierced the swirling snow as it pulled up to the curb, brakes hissing. Valencia moved toward it, then paused and turned back. Valencia reached into her leather handbag and pulled out a business card. She pressed it into his cold hand, her warm fingers lingering for just a moment. "In case you ever need anything," she said. "I mean it." He took it, slipping it into his folder without looking at it. "Thank you." Valencia stepped onto the bus, then glanced back one more time. Thomas watched until the bus disappeared into the snow and darkness, until he was alone again with the wind and the cold. Thomas stood shivering at the bus stop for a long moment after Valencia left, then walked into the night toward his rusted 1998 Chevy pickup, parked behind the old textile mill on Detroit's east side. The cold bit through his thin flannel shirt with vicious intensity, but he didn't regret giving away the coat. Couldn't regret it, even as his teeth began to chatter uncontrollably. That woman had needed help. He'd been able to provide it. That was enough. It had to be enough. He climbed into the back seat of the truck, wrapped himself in the emergency blanket he kept there, and curled into as tight a ball as he could manage. The cold was relentless, seeping into his bones no matter how tightly he wrapped the thin blanket around himself. Sleep came only in short, shivering bursts. When gray light finally filtered through the frosted windows, Thomas forced himself to move. Every joint ached, his fingers were stiff, his breath shallow, but survival didn't allow indulgence. He made his way to the gas station 3 blocks away, where the young attendant Marcus let him use the bathroom to wash up. Thomas shaved carefully with a disposable razor, brushed his teeth, and changed into his one clean shirt, the one he kept sealed in a garbage bag like a fragile secret. He studied his reflection in the cracked mirror. He looked tired, older than 46, dark circles hollowed his eyes from the terrible night. But clean, presentable, respectable enough, he hoped, for interview number 8. Cold night? Marcus asked when Thomas emerged, handing him a thermos of hot water for instant coffee. Yeah, Thomas said. Pretty cold. Marcus studied him. Where's your jacket, man? Gave it to someone who needed it more. Marcus shook his head slowly, something like admiration in his tone. You're a better man than most, Thomas weighed. The interview that morning was at a small engineering consulting firm. Thomas arrived 15 minutes early, as always, and answered every question with quiet confidence born of 15 years' experience. He talked about bridge assessments, about structural integrity, about solving problems that kept people safe. But then came the familiar shift, the hiring manager's expression changing the moment he asked about the gap in Thomas's employment. Thomas explained about personal circumstances and being ready to return. Interest turned to sympathy, then to polite dismissal. We'll be in touch. He'd heard it before. He knew what it meant. Not ready to face another long cold afternoon in the truck, Thomas wandered the streets, the city he'd called home for 20 years now, feeling like it belonged to someone else. Eventually he ended up at the public library, tall windows, humming radiators and warmth that felt like mercy. He spent the afternoon there, as he often did, reading, searching job postings, submitting applications one after another. Each submission was a small act of faith, a refusal to believe the world had already made up its mind about him. Near closing time, he opened his folder and saw the business card again. Valencia Brooks, Chief Executive Officer, Meridian Technologies. He'd heard of Meridian, of course. Everyone had. A success story in Detroit tech, a company he'd once admired back when life had structure and purpose. He almost laughed at the absurdity of all the people to help at a bus stop. He'd given his only coat to one of the most powerful women in the city. The card felt heavy in his hand. She'd said, "Call if you need anything." But what could he possibly say? It felt wrong, like turning kindness into transaction. So he slipped it back into his folder and left the library when the lights dimmed. The second night was worse. The temperature had dropped again, the wind sharper, the truck colder than before. He dozed fitfully, the cold pressing in like a living thing. Pride wouldn't keep him alive much longer, he knew that now. By morning, he could barely feel his fingers. He stumbled back to the gas station, moving on instinct more than strength. Marcus looked up from behind the counter and frowned immediately. "You look frozen, man. Hold on." Thomas tried to wave him off. "I'm fine." "No, you're not." Marcus disappeared into the back and returned holding a heavy navy blue coat. The zipper was broken, but the lining looked thick and warm. "Here, it's an extra one I keep around. Take it." Thomas hesitated. "I can't." "You can," Marcus said firmly. "You gave away yours, right? Consider this the universe evening the score." Thomas wanted to refuse, to protect what little pride he had left, but the warmth of Marcus's eyes reminded him of that moment at the bus stop, the same kind of uncalculated compassion. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'll return it as soon as I can." "Don't worry about it," Marcus replied. Just stay warm, all right. Thomas slipped into the coat. It hung loose on his frame, the sleeves too long, the zipper useless, but the insulation trapped heat immediately. The relief was almost painful. You have no idea what this means, he said, his voice rough. Marcus smiled faintly. Maybe I do. Thomas left the gas station feeling lighter, warmer, not just from the coat, but from the reminder that kindness wasn't dead in the world. It traveled from one person to another, circling back in unexpected ways. That evening, as the sky darkened and the temperature dropped again, Thomas found himself standing outside the downtown office building that housed Meridian Technologies. It was a modern structure, all glass and steel, with warm light glowing from the windows of the occupied offices. Through the lobby windows, he could see people moving purposefully, professionals heading home after a day of meaningful work, lives full of purpose and direction and stability. He pulled out Valencia's business card and stared at it for a long time. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. The nights were too cold and he was too tired, and the endless cycle of rejections had worn him down to the point where he could admit, finally, that he needed help. Real help. Not just kind gestures but something substantial, something that might actually change his circumstances. Before he could talk himself out of it, he pulled out his phone, an old model with a cracked screen that he kept charged at the library, with a prepaid plan that gave him just enough minutes for emergency calls. He dialed the number on the card. It rang 3 times. Then a professional female voice answered. Valencia Brooks's office, this is Jennifer speaking. Thomas almost hung up. Hi, he managed. My name is Thomas Wade. I met Miss Brooks 2 nights ago and she gave me her card. I was hoping I might be able to speak with her. There was a pause. Brooks is in meetings for the rest of the evening. May I ask what this is regarding? What was it regarding? How did you explain that 2 nights ago you gave this woman your only coat and now you were calling because you had nowhere else to turn? She said to call if I needed anything. Thomas said simply, and I need help. I'm a structural engineer, and I've been looking for work for 2 months with no success. I thought maybe she might know of opportunities, or could point me in the right direction. Another pause. Then, more gently, I see, can I take your number? I'll make sure Miss Brooks gets the message. Thomas gave her his number, not expecting anything to come of it. Assistants said things like that all the time, took messages that went nowhere, made promises on behalf of busy executives who never followed through. Thank you, he said. I appreciate it. He hung up and stood on the cold street, looking up at the glowing windows of Meridian Technologies, wondering if he'd just made a fool of himself, wondering if Valencia Brooks even remembered the encounter at the bus stop clearly, wondering if kindness offered in one moment meant anything the next day, the next week, when real life and real responsibilities took precedence over sentimental gestures. He was about to walk away when his phone rang. The cracked screen lit up with an unknown number. Hello, he answered. Thomas Wade. A woman's voice, familiar somehow. Yes, this is Valencia Brooks. Jennifer said you called. Thomas's heart jumped. I didn't expect to hear back so quickly. I'm sorry to bother you. You're not bothering me, Valencia said, and he could hear genuine warmth in her voice, not just professional courtesy. I was hoping you'd call. How are you? The question caught him off guard. When was the last time someone had asked how he was and actually seemed to care about the answer? I'm managing, he said, unable to quite admit how badly he was doing to this successful stranger. On the other end of the line, Valencia went quiet. She turned from her desk and walked to the window, city lights reflecting faintly in the glass. The sound of his voice, steady but worn, polite but tired, pulled her backward in time. That night, the snow, the man who had given her his coat, the board meeting replayed in her mind, voices raised, faces she'd once trusted turning sharp, every accusation landing like a slap. She'd walked out before it was over, too angry to stay, too humiliated to care that she'd left her coat behind. Then came the storm, the bitter wind, the snow, and the stranger who'd given her his only protection without hesitation. On the bus afterward, she'd sat clutching that coat like something sacred, wondering when kindness had become such a rare thing in her world. Now, hearing that same voice again, Tired, uncertain, humble, she felt something shift inside her. She couldn't ignore it. "Thomas, where are you right now?" "I'm downtown, near your building actually." "Can you come up?" she said softly. "I'd like to talk to you in person." Thomas looked down at himself. The too large borrowed coat, the worn pants, the boots that had seen better days. "I'm not really dressed for office buildings. I don't care what you're wearing. Can you come up? Please." Something in her voice made it impossible to refuse. "Okay, yes, I'll be right there." He entered the building with trepidation, feeling out of place among the well-dressed professionals still working late, the modern lobby with its polished floors and contemporary art. The security guard looked at him with obvious suspicion until Thomas explained he had an appointment with Valencia Brooks, at which point the guard's expression shifted to surprise, and he quickly issued a visitor badge and directed Thomas to the elevators. The Meridian Technologies offices occupied the entire 20th floor. When the elevator doors opened, Thomas stepped into a space that spoke of success and innovation, of a company that was thriving. Open workspaces, collaborative areas, floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the Detroit skyline, state-of-the-art technology everywhere he looked. A woman who must have been Jennifer met him at reception, professional and polite. "Mr. Wade, Miss Brooks is expecting you. Please follow me." She led him through the office to a corner suite with glass walls and a view that stretched across the city. Valencia was standing at the window, still dressed in professional attire, her braids now pulled back in an elegant updo. She turned when she heard them approach, and her face lit up with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased to see him. "Thomas," she said warmly, gesturing him inside. "Please come in, sit down." Jennifer closed the door behind him, leaving them alone. Thomas sat awkwardly in one of the modern chairs facing Valencia's desk, suddenly acutely aware of the contrast between them. She belonged in this space. He very clearly did not. Valencia sat down across from him, not behind her desk, but in the chair next to his, eliminating the barrier between them. "I've been thinking about you," she said without preamble. "About that night at the bus stop." "I've been thinking about it too," Thomas admitted. "Can I ask you something? And will you be honest with me?" He nodded, wary but willing. "When you gave me your coat, where did you go after I got on the bus?" Thomas looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "Back to my truck." Valencia was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "You're living in your truck." It wasn't a question, but Thomas nodded anyway. "And you gave me your only coat." She said it softly, with something like wonder in her voice. "You needed it in that moment," Thomas said simply. "It was the right thing to do." Valencia leaned forward slightly, her eyes searching his face. "Tell me about yourself, Thomas. I don't mean your circumstances, I mean you. Who you are, what you do, what brought you to that bus stop that night." And so he did, not all at once, not as a plea or a sob story, but as a straightforward account of his life. He told her about his career as a structural engineer, about his 15 years at Henderson and Associates. He explained his specialization in bridge assessment and rehabilitation, his work on major municipal projects, his reputation for thorough, meticulous analysis that had saved cities millions of dollars by identifying problems before they became catastrophic. He talked about specific projects, about the challenges he'd solved, about the satisfaction of applying mathematics and physics and materials science to real-world problems. His voice became more animated as he discussed the work, the professional he'd been, the expertise he'd built over years of dedication. Then he told her about his wife Catherine, how cancer had taken her slowly over 2 years, how the medical bills had drained everything they'd saved, how he'd taken leave from work to care for her in her final months, how the company had downsized while he was gone, eliminating his position, how he tried to find new work but kept hearing that his skills had grown stale, that the gap in his employment was concerning, that they'd decided to go with other candidates. He told her about his son Cameron, 13 years old, living with his sister's family in Ohio. About how Thomas had insisted Cameron go there when it became clear Thomas couldn't provide stable housing anymore. About how that separation tore at him every single day, how he called whenever he could, how Cameron always asked when they could be together again. I keep telling him soon, Thomas said, his voice rough, but I don't know if he still believes me. Valencia listened to all of this without interrupting, without offering sympathy or pity, just listening with complete attention. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, her expression thoughtful. "What if I told you I have a position available?" she finally said. Thomas's heart leaped, then immediately tempered itself with caution. "I would be grateful for any opportunity. But I'm not looking for charity, Miss Brooks. I'm looking for a chance to prove what I can do. Call me Valencia, and I'm not talking about charity." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "Our infrastructure assessment division is expanding. We're looking for someone with deep expertise in structural engineering. Someone who can evaluate aging buildings and bridges, develop comprehensive reports for municipalities, work with our software development team to ensure our products serve real-world needs." She turned back to him. "It would be challenging work. We partner with cities across the Midwest, assessing critical infrastructure, identifying potential failure points, developing maintenance and renovation plans. The position requires someone who can balance technical precision with practical constraints, budget limitations, political realities, public safety concerns. Someone with real experience, not just theoretical knowledge." It sounded too good to be true. Exactly the kind of position Thomas had been hoping for, dreaming of, the perfect fit for his skills and experience. "That sounds like exactly what I've been doing for the past 15 years. "I know," Valencia said. "I've actually used Meridian Technologies software before. Back when I was still at Henderson & Associates, your infrastructure planning suite helped us identify structural issues in the Young Municipal Center renovation." Valencia's eyebrows rose slightly with interest. "Then you know what we do. You know the level of technical expertise required." "I do, and I have that expertise. But you don't know that yet. You've only met me once, for a few minutes. You haven't seen my credentials, my work, my references." Valencia turned back to him, and there was something assessing in her eyes now, something sharp and intelligent. "Send me your resume. I want to see your work history, your projects, your publications. I'll review it with my infrastructure division director. We'll do a formal interview, we'll verify everything. But Thomas, I already know something important about you that a resume can't tell me." "What's that?" "That when faced with a choice between your own comfort and someone else's need, you chose to help. Even when it cost you dearly. Even when you had every reason to walk away. That tells me something about your character that no reference check can reveal." Thomas felt tears burning in his eyes and fought them back. "You're considering hiring me because I gave you my coat. I'm considering interviewing you because you demonstrated something rare and valuable. But let me be clear, the job offer will depend entirely on your qualifications. If you're not the right fit technically, I won't hire you. That wouldn't be fair to you, to my company, or to the cities that depend on our assessments. But if your credentials match what you've told me, if your experience is as strong as I suspect, then yes, that act of kindness opened a door." She paused, then added, "Why shouldn't it? We make hiring decisions based on all kinds of factors. Education, experience, references, interview performance. But character matters too. Maybe it should matter more than we typically allow it to." Thomas couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They slipped down his cheeks and he didn't try to hide them. "I don't know what to say. Say you'll send me your resume tonight. Say you'll come in for a formal interview this week. Say you'll give me the chance to help you, the way you helped me, by providing an opportunity for you to prove what you're capable of." "Yes," Thomas managed, his voice breaking. "Yes to all of that. Thank you so much." Valencia reached across and squeezed his hand briefly, a gesture of connection and solidarity. "Don't thank me yet. Prove that I'm right about you. Prove that what I saw in you that night at the bus stop is real. Show me what you're capable of when someone believes in you." "I will," Thomas promised, and it was a vow, a commitment to himself as much as to her. "I swear I will." As he left her office and rode the elevator back down to street level, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope, real, tangible hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope that came from submitting another job application, but something solid and substantial. The possibility that his life might not be over, that he might still have a future, that one act of kindness might have created an opportunity he'd been desperately searching for. He walked back to his truck through the cold Detroit night, but somehow the cold didn't bite as fiercely. Marcus's borrowed coat kept him warm, and more than that, the warmth of possibility, of second chances, of unexpected grace carried him forward. That night, he didn't go back to his truck. Instead, he went to the library and stayed until they closed, using every minute to craft his resume and cover letter. He wrote and rewrote, making sure every word was precise, every claim was accurate, every project was explained clearly. He listed his 15 years of experience, his major projects, his published papers on bridge rehabilitation techniques. He explained his specialization in structural integrity assessment, his expertise in both old and modern construction methods, his ability to balance safety requirements with budget constraints. He attached PDFs of his certifications, his professional engineer license, letters of recommendation from previous supervisors. He made sure nothing was exaggerated or misleading. This was his chance, maybe his only chance, and he would not waste it on false claims or desperate overselling. When he finally hit send at 9:47 that evening, he felt a mix of hope and terror. What if his experience wasn't enough? What if she looked at his resume and realized he'd overstated his qualifications? What if the gap in his employment was too large to overlook, even with all his credentials? But he'd done his best. That was all he could do. 3 days later, his phone rang with a call from Jennifer Valencia's assistant. "Mr. Wade, we'd like to schedule a formal interview for you. Would Thursday at 10 in the morning work?" Thursday, that was only 2 days away. "Yes," Thomas said immediately. "Thursday at 10 is perfect." "Excellent. You'll be meeting with Miss Brooks and Patricia Morgan, our Director of Infrastructure Assessment. Please bring any additional portfolio materials you'd like to present. I'm emailing you the details now." When Thursday arrived, Thomas was more nervous than he'd been for any interview in his life. He'd spent the previous 2 days preparing, reviewing his old projects, rehearsing answers to technical questions, making sure he could explain his work clearly and confidently. He arrived at Meridian Technologies 15 minutes early, wearing his best clothes, clean and pressed. Jennifer greeted him warmly and led him to a conference room where Valencia and another woman were waiting. Patricia Morgan was in her late 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She shook Thomas's hand firmly. "Mr. Wade, I've reviewed your resume, very impressive background." "Thank you. Let's get started," Patricia said, pulling out a folder. "I want to talk specifics. Tell me about the Young Municipal Center renovation. What were the primary structural challenges you encountered?" And Thomas did. For the next hour, Patricia asked detailed, probing questions about his engineering experience, and Thomas answered with the confidence born from years of expertise. She asked about specific projects, about problems he'd encountered and how he'd solved them, about his approach to balancing safety requirements with budget constraints and timeline pressures. She pulled out technical diagrams and asked him to evaluate them on the spot, identifying potential issues. She presented hypothetical scenarios, budget limitations and safety concerns, and asked how he would handle them. She challenged his assumptions, questioned his methodology, pushed him to explain his reasoning. Thomas found himself relaxing into the conversation despite the pressure. This was his element. This was what he was good at. He could discuss load-bearing calculations and material stress factors and foundation integrity with the fluency of someone who'd spent 15 years living and breathing this work. Patricia's expression shifted gradually from professional skepticism to genuine interest. She leaned forward, engaged, asking follow-up questions that suggested she was actually considering him seriously for the position. "Tell me about your experience with Meridian Technologies software," she said. "Valencia mentioned you've used our products extensively," Thomas said. "During the Young Municipal Center project, we used your infrastructure planning suite for structural modeling. It was instrumental in identifying stress points in the original framework that weren't apparent from the blueprints alone. The predictive modeling features helped us anticipate how different renovation approaches would affect the building's long-term stability." He continued, discussing specific features of the software, ways it had helped his team, suggestions he'd had at the time for improvements. Patricia took notes, nodding occasionally. At the end of the hour, Patricia looked at Valencia and nodded once, a deliberate gesture that seemed to carry weight. "Thomas," Patricia said, "I'm going to be direct with you. Your qualifications are exceptional. Your experience is exactly what we need. Your understanding of both the technical and practical aspects of infrastructure assessment is rare. Based solely on your credentials and this interview, you're the strongest candidate we've seen for this position." Thomas felt his heart pounding. "Thank you. However," Patricia continued, "I need to be transparent about something. I know about your current circumstances. Valencia told me, and I want you to know that's not a factor in this decision. You're not getting this job because of your situation. You're getting it because you're qualified. Do you understand that?" "I do," Thomas said, "and I appreciate you saying it." Patricia smiled slightly. "Good. Then pending reference checks and a standard background review, we'd like to offer you the position of Senior Infrastructure Assessment Engineer. Starting salary of $95,000 annually, full health benefits, 4 weeks vacation, and flexible work arrangements while you get back on your feet." Thomas sat frozen, unable to process what he'd just heard. $95,000. That was more than he'd made at his old job, more than he'd dared to hope for. "You're serious," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Completely serious," Valencia confirmed. "Patricia doesn't make hiring decisions lightly. You're exactly what we need." "When can you start?" Patricia asked. Thomas laughed, a sound somewhere between joy and disbelief. "Today, right now, whenever you want me. Let's say next Monday," Patricia said practically. "That gives us time to finalize the paperwork and get your workstation set up. It also gives you time to sort out your living situation." Valencia mentioned the company might be able to help with that. Valencia leaned forward. "We have relationships with several housing agencies that work with professionals in transition. We can arrange temporary housing immediately, help you find a permanent apartment once you have steady income. We can also provide an advance on your first paycheck if that would help with immediate expenses." Thomas nodded, too overwhelmed to speak for a moment. Everything was happening so fast. Too fast, maybe, except that he'd been drowning for so long that this felt like finally breaking the surface, gasping for air, desperate and grateful. "There's one more thing," Valencia said gently. "Your son, you mentioned he's living with family in Ohio. Cameron. He's 13. Once you're settled in housing and have steady income, we'll support you in bringing him home if that's what you want. Flexible hours when you need them for custody arrangements or school meetings. Whatever you need to rebuild that relationship." The thought hit Thomas like a physical blow. Cameron. Coming home, living together again. Being a real father again, not just a voice on occasional phone calls, not just a source of disappointment and broken promises. "I want that more than anything," he said, his voice breaking. "But it'll take time, months probably. I need to prove I'm stable, that I can provide for him properly. His aunt and uncle have been incredible, giving him stability when I couldn't. I won't disrupt that until I'm certain I can offer him something better." "That's wise," Patricia said. "And that's exactly the kind of thoughtful, responsible approach that tells me we made the right decision hiring you." Valencia reached across the table. "Welcome to Meridian, Thomas." He took her hand, gripping it tightly. "Thank you. I won't let you down. I promise you that." "I know you won't," Valencia said simply. The following Monday, Thomas Wade walked into Meridian Technologies as an employee for the first time. He wore a new suit, purchased with the advance from his first paycheck, his first professional clothing in months. He'd showered that morning in the extended stay hotel room Meridian Technologies had arranged, standing under hot water for 20 minutes, washing away the grime and exhaustion of months on the streets. He looked like himself again, the professional, the engineer, the man he'd been before everything fell apart. Patricia Morgan met him at reception and led him through the office. "Let me introduce you to the team," she said. The Infrastructure Assessment Division consisted of 6 people, 4 engineers, 2 data analysts, and now Thomas. They were gathered in their section of the office, and Patricia made quick introductions. "Everyone, this is Thomas Wade, our new Senior Infrastructure Assessment Engineer. Thomas has 15 years of experience in structural engineering, extensive background in bridge rehabilitation and building assessment. He's worked on major municipal projects throughout Michigan. I'm confident he's going to be a tremendous asset to this team." The team members welcomed him warmly, genuinely interested in his background. They showed him his workstation, a modern desk with dual monitors near a window overlooking the city. His name was already printed on a placard, Thomas Wade, Senior Infrastructure Assessment Engineer. He sat down at that desk, ran his hands over the smooth surface, and felt something break open inside his chest. This was real. This was happening. He had a job. A real job doing the work he loved, work he was good at, work that mattered. Patricia pulled up a chair beside him. I'm going to start you on something substantial right away. No easing in, no simple assignments. I want to see what you can do. She opened a file on his computer. This is a bridge rehabilitation project in Flint. The Henderson Bridge, built in 1962, showing significant structural deterioration. The city hired us to do a comprehensive assessment and develop renovation recommendations. The previous engineer's report identified some issues, but I'm not satisfied with the analysis. I want a fresh set of eyes on it. Your eyes. He spent the entire morning studying the bridge's data, blueprints, inspection reports, photographs. Within hours, patterns began to emerge, hidden weaknesses, overlooked warning signs. Years of experience guided his eye to problems others had missed. By lunch, he'd identified several critical issues: cracks, rust, uneven load distribution, evidence that the bridge was in worse condition than anyone realized. He documented everything carefully, supported each conclusion with data, and outlined both immediate safety measures and long-term repair strategies. Patricia stopped by his desk mid-afternoon. How's it going? I've completed my initial assessment, Thomas said, and I have some concerns. He walked her through his findings, explaining each issue in detail, showing her the data that supported his conclusions. Patricia listened carefully, asking sharp questions, challenging his assumptions in ways that made Thomas respect her even more. When he finished, Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "This is excellent work, Thomas. Thorough, precise, well documented. And you're right, the previous engineer missed these issues. If your analysis is correct, and I believe it is, this bridge is significantly more at risk than we thought. I'd recommend immediate traffic restrictions while we develop a full renovation plan," Thomas said. "Nothing catastrophic yet, but the margin of safety is smaller than anyone realized." "I'll contact the city today," Patricia said. "They need to know about this immediately." She paused, then added, "You just potentially saved lives, Thomas. Your analysis identified problems that could have led to catastrophic failure. That's why this work matters. That's what we do here." Thomas felt a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. This was why he'd become an engineer. To solve problems that mattered, to protect people, to use his skills to make the world safer. When he left the office that evening, Patricia stopped him at the elevator. "Exceptional work today, Thomas. Your analysis of that Flint bridge was exactly what we needed. Thorough, clear, actionable. You belong here, don't doubt that." "Thank you," Thomas said, feeling something he hadn't felt in so long. Pride, not arrogance, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing he'd done good work that mattered, work that would make a real difference. Over the following weeks, Thomas settled into a rhythm. Work during the day, evenings spent apartment hunting, and sorting out the practical details of rebuilding a life. Meridian Technologies' housing assistance program connected him with a landlord willing to work with someone whose credit history had been destroyed by medical bills, and by the end of his second month, he moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a modest but safe neighborhood. It wasn't much. The building was old, the apartment small, the furniture mostly second-hand pieces, donated by Meridian Technologies' employee assistance program, and supplemented with items from thrift stores. But it was his, a real home with heat and running water, and a door he could lock. A place where he could sleep in an actual bed, cook meals in a real kitchen, shower whenever he wanted. The first night in that apartment, Thomas stood at the window looking out at the Detroit skyline and called his son, "Dad." Cameron's voice came through excited and hopeful, the way it always did when Thomas called these days. "Hey buddy, I've got some news, good news, the best news. I got an apartment, a real place, 2 bedrooms, and I was thinking, maybe during Christmas break, you could come visit for a week. Stay with me, see the city, see my new job, spend some real time together." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Thomas worried the connection had dropped. Then Cameron spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Really, you mean it? You're not going to have to cancel?" The question hurt, because Thomas understood exactly why Cameron asked it. How many times had he made promises he couldn't keep? How many times had Cameron's hopes been raised, only to be disappointed? I mean it, Thomas said firmly. I have a stable job, I have an apartment with a bedroom for you. I've already talked to your aunt and uncle, and they're fine with it. This is really happening, Cameron. I promise you. Okay, Cameron said, and Thomas could hear the smile in his voice. Okay, yes, I want to come visit, I want to see your apartment, and meet your coworkers, and just hang out with you. They talked for another hour, Cameron asking questions about the apartment, about Thomas's job, about Detroit, about everything. And for the first time in 18 months, Thomas could answer those questions with concrete details, with real plans, with hope instead of apologies. At work, Thomas continued to prove that Patricia and Valencia's faith in him wasn't misplaced. His assessments were consistently thorough and insightful, his reports clear and actionable. Within 3 months, he was leading projects, training newer engineers, becoming an integral part of the team. When he completed the full assessment report for the Flint Bridge, documenting the structural issues, and presenting a comprehensive renovation plan that balanced safety concerns with the city's budget constraints, the city officials were initially skeptical. But when Thomas presented his findings in person, walking them through the data, showing them the photographs and calculations that supported his conclusions, they realized the seriousness of the situation. The city implemented his recommendations immediately. Traffic restrictions went into place. Emergency repairs addressed the most critical issues. A long-term renovation plan was approved based on Thomas's detailed specifications. 6 months later, during the renovation work, construction crews discovered additional structural problems that Thomas's analysis had predicted, but hadn't been able to fully confirm without excavation. His foresight had allowed the renovation plan to account for these issues, preventing costly delays and change orders. Patricia called Thomas into her office. The city engineer just called. He wanted me to thank you personally. Your analysis and planning saved them an estimated $2 million in unexpected costs. More importantly, you may have prevented a bridge collapse that could have injured or killed dozens of people. Thomas felt a profound sense of satisfaction. This was why he devoted his life to this work, not for recognition or money, but for moments like this, for knowing that his skills, his knowledge, his careful attention to detail had made a tangible difference. I was just doing my job, he said. You were doing exceptional work, Patricia corrected. There's a difference. By the time Christmas break arrived, Thomas had been with Meridian Technologies for 4 months. He'd saved money, furnished his apartment properly, established himself as a valued employee, proved his reliability and expertise. When Cameron arrived, stepping off the bus with a duffel bag and a smile that could light up the whole city, Thomas felt like his life had truly fully restarted. They spent a week together, father and son, reconnecting in ways they hadn't been able to during brief phone calls. They cooked meals together in Thomas's small kitchen, with Cameron teaching his father about recipes he'd learned from his aunt. They walked around Detroit, Thomas showing his son the city he'd rediscovered, pointing out the bridges and buildings he'd worked on over the years. Thomas took Cameron to work one day, showing him the offices, introducing him to colleagues, explaining what he did. Cameron was fascinated, asking intelligent questions that made Thomas realize his son was growing up, becoming thoughtful and curious and capable. Your dad's one of our best, Patricia told Cameron. We're very lucky to have him on our team. Cameron beamed with pride. I know, he's always been the best at everything. I'm glad other people can see that now too. On Christmas Eve, Valencia invited them both to the company holiday party, held in an elegant hotel ballroom downtown. It was a formal affair, and Thomas hesitated, not sure if it was appropriate to bring his 13-year-old son. But Valencia insisted. You're part of the Meridian family now, she said, both of you. At the party, Cameron stayed close to Thomas's side, a little overwhelmed by the crowd and the formal atmosphere. Thomas introduced him to colleagues, and Cameron was polite and articulate, shaking hands, making eye contact, demonstrating the good manners that Thomas and Catherine had tried to instill in him years ago. Valencia found them standing near the dessert table, Cameron's plate loaded with cookies and small cakes. You must be Cameron, Valencia said warmly, crouching down to his level. I've heard so much about you. Your father talks about you all the time. Cameron looked at her with wide eyes. "You're Miss Brooks. My dad told me about how you gave him this chance. Thank you for believing in him." Valencia smiled. "Your father earned this chance through his own merit. I just gave him the opportunity to show what he was capable of, and he's exceeded every expectation. You should be very proud of him." "I am," Cameron said seriously. "I always have been, even when things were hard." Valencia looked up at Thomas, and something passed between them. An understanding, a recognition of the journey they'd both been on, the choices they'd both made, the unexpected grace that had brought them to this moment. Later that night, after the party, after Cameron had fallen asleep on the couch in the apartment, Thomas stood at the window again, looking out at the city lights. 6 months ago, he'd been sleeping in his truck, hopeless and alone, wondering if his life was effectively over. Now he had a job he loved, a home, his son sleeping peacefully 10 feet away, a future that felt possible and real, all because he'd given away his coat on a cold night to a stranger who needed it, all because he'd chosen kindness over self-preservation, compassion over survival, humanity over hardship. The kindness hadn't been calculated. He hadn't given Valencia his coat expecting anything in return. He'd done it because it was right, because she was suffering, because he couldn't walk away from someone in need even when he had so little himself. And yet somehow that uncalculated kindness had come back to him, transformed into something beyond anything he could have imagined. Not because he deserved it or earned it through the gift, but because kindness has its own logic, its own way of rippling outward, touching lives in unexpected ways. The next 6 months brought more stability and growth. Thomas continued excelling at Meridian Technologies, taking on increasingly complex projects. He developed new assessment protocols that improved the company's efficiency and accuracy. His methodical approach and attention to detail became legendary within the infrastructure division. He was promoted to lead infrastructure engineer, given a team to manage, trusted with the company's most important municipal contracts. But more importantly, with his income stable and his life rebuilt, Thomas petitioned to regain full custody of Cameron. His son's aunt and uncle, seeing how well Thomas was doing, how stable his life had become, agreed it was time for father and son to be together again permanently. The transition was gradual and thoughtful, prioritizing Cameron's well-being and stability above all else. Cameron transferred to a Detroit middle school in January, moved into the second bedroom that Thomas had carefully prepared for him. They established routines together, negotiated responsibilities and rules, figured out how to be a family again after months of separation. It wasn't always smooth, there were adjustments and growing pains, moments of frustration and miscommunication, but they worked through it together, committed to rebuilding what had been broken. They ate dinner together most nights, talked about school and work and life. Cameron joined the school basketball team. Thomas helped with homework, attended parent-teacher conferences, showed up for games whenever his work schedule allowed. Slowly, carefully, they rebuilt their relationship, finding their way back to each other. And Thomas never forgot the lesson of that cold night at the bus stop. He volunteered at homeless shelters on weekends, served meals, donated clothes, talked to men and women who reminded him of who he'd been just a year before. He saw their humanity when others looked away, remembered how invisible he'd felt, how much one act of kindness had meant, how desperate he'd been for someone to see him as a person rather than a problem. He treated every person he encountered with dignity and respect, remembering that circumstances could change in an instant, that anyone could end up where he'd been, that the line between housed and homeless was thinner than most people wanted to believe. At Meridian, Thomas approached Valencia with an idea that had been forming in his mind for months. "I keep thinking about how I got this job," he said. "About how traditional hiring practices excluded me despite my qualifications. And I keep wondering how many other people are out there with valuable skills who just need someone to look past their circumstances." Valencia listened carefully. As Thomas spoke, Valencia found herself thinking back to that night nearly 2 years ago. The boardroom confrontation, the cold stares, the words that had cut deeper than she'd ever admitted. "You're losing control of your company, Valencia. People don't trust you anymore. They fear you." She'd carried those words like a weight ever since. But now, listening to Thomas describe a program built on trust and second chances, she realized how far she'd come, how far they both had. Creating second foundations wasn't just redemption for him, it was for her too. What if we created a hiring program specifically for people with professional backgrounds who've fallen on hard times? Thomas continued. People like me, people with skills and experience and education who've lost jobs due to illness or family emergencies or bad luck. People who are capable but who can't get past the resume screening because of employment gaps or current housing situations. Valencia's eyes lit up with interest. Tell me more. We could partner with homeless shelters and re-entry programs to identify individuals with relevant backgrounds, Thomas said. Provide them with resume assistance, interview coaching, professional clothing if needed. Not charity, but opportunity. A chance to prove themselves based on their skills rather than their circumstances. I like it, Valencia said. But how do we ensure quality? How do we distinguish between people who have genuine professional skills and people who are just desperate for any job? Thorough screening, Thomas said. Verify credentials, check educational backgrounds, conduct skills assessments, but do it with the understanding that someone living in a shelter or their car might not have perfect references or might struggle with a traditional interview process. Look at the whole person, not just their current situation. They spent the next several months developing the program together. Valencia handled the corporate side while Thomas worked with shelters and re-entry programs, learning about the barriers people faced and how to break them. They called it Second Foundations, a name that reflected the idea of rebuilding, of giving people a chance to reconstruct their lives on more solid ground. The program launched a year after Thomas joined Meridian. It started small, partnering with 3 local shelters, accepting applications from individuals with documented professional backgrounds. Thomas led the program personally, becoming its most passionate advocate and its clearest proof of concept. He interviewed dozens of candidates, looking past the rough appearances and gaps in employment to find the capability beneath. He asked probing questions about their backgrounds, their skills, their work history. He verified credentials carefully, checked references, conducted skills assessments, and he found remarkable people. An accountant who'd lost everything in a divorce. A software developer who'd struggled with addiction but was now 2 years sober. A nurse who'd been caring for aging parents and lost her job when she couldn't maintain consistent attendance. A marketing professional who'd fled domestic violence and was rebuilding from nothing. People with skills, people with potential, people who just needed a chance. Thomas hired 15 people in the first year, each one carefully placed in positions matching their skills, each one given the same kind of comprehensive support that Meridian Technologies had given him. Temporary housing assistance, advances on paychecks, flexible scheduling during the transition period, job coaching and professional mentoring. And the program worked, not perfectly, not without challenges and setbacks. 2 of the 15 didn't succeed, unable to manage the transition or struggling with personal issues that made consistent employment impossible. But 13 did. 13 people who'd been homeless or marginally housed or in crisis found stable employment, rebuilt their lives, proved that their circumstances didn't define their capabilities. Most of them succeeded remarkably well, becoming valued employees, contributing meaningfully to the company, demonstrating that homelessness or hardship wasn't a character flaw, but a circumstance that could be overcome with support and opportunity. The business community noticed. Local media outlets ran stories about Meridian's innovative approach to hiring. Other companies reached out, wanting to learn from the model, wanting to understand how to implement similar programs. Valencia found herself invited to speak at conferences and business forums about corporate social responsibility and the business case for second chance hiring. The attention made Thomas uncomfortable at first. He didn't want to be the face of homelessness or the poster child for corporate charity. But Valencia helped him understand that sharing his story wasn't about personal recognition. It was about changing minds, challenging assumptions, demonstrating that people like him existed and had value. Your story matters, she told him. Not because you're special or unique, but because you're not. Because there are thousands of people like you out there, talented and capable people who've been excluded from opportunities because of circumstances beyond their control. When people hear your story, they start to question their assumptions. They start to wonder who else they might be overlooking. 2 years after that night at the bus stop, Valencia stood on a stage at the National Business Ethics Conference in Chicago, addressing an audience of 500 business leaders, investors and entrepreneurs. Thomas sat in the front row with Cameron beside him, both dressed in suits, both successful in their own ways now. Valencia told their story, not as a heartwarming anecdote designed to tug at emotions, but as a challenge to the business world's assumptions about value, worth, and potential. 2 years ago, on a cold December night in Detroit, I forgot my coat before leaving work, she began. I was running late for a meeting, I was distracted, and I ended up at a bus stop in a snowstorm without proper protection from the cold. A stranger at that bus stop, a man I'd never met, gave me his coat, his only coat, and then he walked away into the snow. She paused, letting the audience absorb this. That man was homeless, living in his truck, surviving on maybe $200. He'd just been rejected for his 8th job interview in 2 weeks. He was cold and exhausted and had every reason to prioritize his own survival. But he didn't. He saw someone in need and he helped, without calculation, without expectation of reward, without even telling me his circumstances. Valencia's voice grew stronger. Traditional hiring practices would have excluded that man from every position at my company. Employment gap, too long, current housing situation, unacceptable, lack of recent references, disqualifying. His resume would have been rejected by our automated screening system before any human ever saw it. She let that sink in. But that automated system couldn't measure what I learned about him in those few minutes at that bus stop. It couldn't measure his character, his compassion, his humanity. And when he finally called me, desperate for help, I took a chance on him. Not blindly, not without verification. I looked at his credentials, I verified his experience, I put him through a rigorous interview process, and I discovered that he was exactly as skilled and capable as his resume suggested. Valencia described Thomas's work, his analysis of the Flint Bridge that had potentially saved lives and millions of dollars, his leadership in the infrastructure division, his development of the Second Foundations program. Thomas Wade isn't exceptional, she said. That's not an insult. It's the point. He's not some rare genius or extraordinary talent. He's a skilled professional with solid experience who fell into hard times through a combination of bad luck and circumstances beyond his control. And there are thousands of people like him, tens of thousands. Talented, capable, educated people who've been systematically excluded from opportunities because our hiring practices prioritize credentials over character, resumes over humanity, current circumstances over potential contribution. She paused, looking directly at the audience. The business case for second chance hiring isn't just ethical, it's practical. We're accessing a talent pool that most companies ignore. We're building loyalty and dedication that can't be bought. Thomas didn't just meet expectations, he exceeded them consistently. He brought expertise we needed, perspective we valued, and commitment we couldn't have purchased at any price. And through Second Foundations, we've discovered dozens of other talented professionals who just needed someone to look past their circumstances to see their capabilities. She concluded with words she'd crafted carefully. We all have coats to give, in various forms. Resources, connections, opportunities, belief, and we never know which act of kindness might be the one that changes everything. But more than that, we have a responsibility as business leaders to question our assumptions, to challenge systems that exclude talented people for arbitrary reasons, to recognize that human potential exists in unexpected places. The audience rose in a standing ovation that went on for several minutes. But Valencia wasn't looking at them. She was looking at Thomas, who sat with tears streaming down his face, his son's hand gripped tightly in his. She'd kept her promise to him, to honor what he'd done, to make it mean something larger than one person's kindness. And he'd kept his promise to her, to prove her faith wasn't misplaced, to show that second chances weren't charity but investments in human potential. After the talk, as people crowded around Valencia, wanting to shake her hand, share their own stories, ask questions about implementing similar programs, Thomas slipped quietly toward the exit with Cameron, not wanting to intrude on her moment. But Valencia saw them leaving and broke away from the crowd. "You're not going to say goodbye," she called. Thomas turned back, smiling through his tears. "I figured you had your hands full, never too full for you." She hugged him tightly, a real hug between friends who'd been through something profound together. Then she crouched down to Cameron's level. "Your dad's pretty amazing, you know that." Cameron grinned, his face wet with tears but glowing with pride. "Yeah, I definitely know. You should also know that he never gave up on you, not even on the darkest days when everything seemed impossible. Every decision he made, every struggle he endured, was about getting back to you. He's a good man. Cameron looked up at his father, his eyes shining with love and admiration. I know that too. Best dad ever. As they walked out into the cold December night, Thomas pulled Cameron close, father and son together against the winter wind. The city lights sparkled around them, the same city that had seemed so dark and impossible 2 years before. But everything was different now. Dad, Cameron said as they walked toward the parking garage, when I grow up, I want to help people like you and Miss Brooks do. Thomas stopped walking and knelt down, looking his son in the eyes with complete seriousness. You don't have to wait until you grow up, Cameron, you can start right now. Every day, every choice, every time you see someone who needs help, you can decide to be the person who gives it, who sees them, who remembers that they're human beings who matter. Even if I don't have much to give, especially then, Thomas said, thinking of that coat, that cold night, that choice that changed everything. Sometimes what you have to give is exactly enough to change the world. Not because it's much, but because it's given freely, without calculation, from the heart. That's when kindness has real power. Cameron nodded thoughtfully. Like you giving Miss Brooks your coat, exactly like that. I didn't think about what I might get in return. I just saw someone who needed help, and I helped. That's all, but that simple choice opened up possibilities I never could have imagined. They walked home through the quiet streets of Chicago, father and son together, no longer homeless or separated but permanently reunited, building a real life together. Behind them in the auditorium, Valencia was still surrounded by people, but she didn't feel alone. She felt connected, purposeful, part of something larger than herself, because kindness, real kindness given without expectation or calculation, doesn't just change one life. It ripples outward, touching person after person, creating waves that spread further than we can ever imagine or measure. Thomas's kindness had reminded Valencia of what truly mattered, had challenged her assumptions about value and worth, had inspired her to build something meaningful. Valencia's response had given Thomas a chance to prove his capabilities, had restored his dignity and his future, had reunited him with his son. And together, they'd created something that would help countless others. A program, a philosophy, a living example that people mattered more than resumes, that humanity was good business, that the measure of success wasn't just what you accumulated, but what you gave away and what you helped others achieve. 6 months later, the second Foundations program had expanded to 3 other cities. Thomas had been promoted again, this time to Director of Structural Innovation, overseeing all of Meridian Technologies' infrastructure assessment work across the Midwest. Cameron was thriving in school, making friends, excelling in basketball, being a normal teenager with normal teenage concerns and joys. And Valencia had been named one of Fortune magazine's most innovative CEOs, not for her technology or her profit margins, but for her humanity, for her willingness to challenge conventional wisdom and build a company culture that valued people as much as performance. But none of them measured success by those external markers anymore. They measured it in lives changed, in opportunities created, in quiet dignity restored to people who'd been told they didn't matter. They measured it in the 60-plus people who'd found employment through Second Foundations, in the families reunited, in the potential realized. The old olive jacket, carefully cleaned and preserved, hung in a glass case in Meridian Technologies' lobby with a simple plaque beneath it. One small act of kindness can rewrite a life. This coat represents our commitment to seeing potential in every person and creating opportunities for those who need them most. Employees walked past it every day, a reminder that they worked for something more than just a company. They worked for an idea that business could be a force for good, that success didn't require leaving people behind, that kindness wasn't weakness but the foundation of real strength. And on cold winter nights when the snow fell on Detroit and people hurried past each other without seeing, without connecting, a few remembered the story of a coat given freely. They slowed down, they looked around, they saw the people they'd been trained to overlook. And sometimes, just sometimes, they stopped and offered help. Because Thomas Wade and Valencia Brooks had proven something essential, that we're all connected. That everyone has value, that second chances aren't charity but investments in human potential. and that the world changes not through grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but through small acts of kindness multiplied across thousands of moments and millions of lives. The coat changed everything, but it was never really about the coat. It was about two people choosing to see each other's humanity in a world that had taught them both to look away. It was about the decision to care when caring wasn't convenient, to help when help wasn't expected, to give when giving cost dearly. And that choice, that simple decision made on one cold night at one bus stop in Detroit, created ripples that would spread for generations, changing not just 2 lives, but hundreds, thousands, countless others touched by the example they set and the program they built. Sometimes the smallest gesture, given at the right moment to the right person, is enough to change the world. Not because the gesture itself is world-changing, but because kindness is contagious, because compassion multiplies, because one person's choice to see and value and help another person can inspire that person to do the same for someone else, and so on, rippling outward infinitely. Thomas Wade gave his coat to a stranger on a cold night. That stranger happened to be in a position to give him something transformative in return. But even if she hadn't been, even if Valencia had just been another person struggling through Detroit winter, the gift would still have mattered. The kindness would still have been real, the humanity would still have been affirmed. That's the lesson, not that kindness will be rewarded with jobs and promotions and recognition, but that kindness matters for its own sake, that choosing to see and value and help other human beings is never wasted, never foolish, never regrettable. Even when we have nothing left to give, we still have our humanity. We still have our capacity to care, we still have our choice to help. And sometimes, if we're very fortunate, that choice comes back to us transformed into something more beautiful and meaningful than we ever could have imagined. Not because we earned it or deserved it through the gift itself, but because kindness has its own mathematics, its own logic, its own way of multiplying and compounding and creating value far beyond the original investment. 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2 in the mathematics of compassion. It equals infinity, spreading outward, touching lives, changing futures, building a world where people see each other's humanity instead of just their circumstances, where we measure worth by character rather than credentials, where everyone has value and everyone deserves a chance to prove it. That's the world Thomas Wade and Valencia Brooks are building, one coat, one chance, one act of kindness at a time, and that's the world we all have the power to create, if we're willing to give what we can, when we can, to whoever needs it, without calculation or expectation of return. Sometimes the smallest gesture is enough to change everything.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.